It's a cold, gray morning in April 1942. 16 B-25 bombers prepare to take off from an American aircraft carrier somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Their target? The Japanese home islands. Still reeling from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor the previous December, American leaders want to demonstrate to the Japanese and to the American public that the United States is prepared to do whatever it takes to win World War II. This raid, named after its commander, General James Doolittle, was the first step in America's war in the Pacific Theater of Operations. In today's lesson, we're going to examine how the United States and its allies began to change the direction of the war in the Pacific. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to answer the following questions. What was the Allied strategy for fighting in the Pacific? How would you describe changes to the U.S. economy during World War II? What were the impacts of World War II on Japanese Americans? You should also begin to consider our big picture question. How can a crisis bring out the best and the worst in people? During World War II, geography, more than anything else, impacted operations in the Pacific Theater. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated the threat posed by the Japanese Navy and its ability to launch attacks from aircraft carriers. Additionally, Japan controlled a significant number of well-fortified island bases spread across thousands of square miles in the Pacific Ocean. Allied military strategists developed a two-pronged plan to combat the Japanese in the Pacific. First, they would neutralize the Japanese naval advantage by attacking the aircraft carriers. Then they would begin island hopping. Island hopping was the strategy of recapturing less fortified islands from the Japanese, which would allow the Allies to move air and naval forces closer to important targets. The purpose of this strategy was to avoid long, costly attacks on well-defended islands, while putting maximum pressure on the Japanese military. The battles of Midway and Guadalcanal put this strategy on full display. By May of 1942, Allied intelligence had broken the code system that Japan used to send messages. They learned that the Japanese Navy planned to attack the remote American base at Midway Island in an attempt to draw American aircraft carriers into battle. Using the information gathered from Japanese messages, the U.S. Navy was able to deliver a crushing blow to the Japanese Navy. In an intense 3-day battle, American bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and a support ship. Midway was a turning point in naval operations, as Japan was unable to replace the men and materials lost in the battle. While the Battle of Midway neutralized the Japanese naval advantage, the Battle of Guadalcanal was the first Allied offensive in their island-hopping campaign. Guadalcanal is a small island in the South Pacific, close to Australia. Japan was in the process of building an airfield on Guadalcanal that would put key Allied bases in range of Japanese bombers. A combined force of American, British, Australian, and New Zealand troops took part in a combined air, sea, and land invasion to take control of Guadalcanal. After 6 months of fighting and the loss of 24,000 of their soldiers, the Japanese retreated from the island. This allowed Allied forces to use the island as a launching spot for aerial bombardment on future target islands. Ultimately, Allied military forces were able to move closer and closer to Japan in order to attack military bases and factories that produced military equipment. Okay, time to review what you've learned. What was the Allied strategy for fighting in the Pacific? In order to execute the plan of neutralizing the Japanese naval advantage and pursuing island hopping to get closer to Japan, the American economy had to make some pretty sudden adjustments. Still recovering from the Great Depression, American industrial output was not where it needed to be to act as the arsenal of democracy. There were two key problems to solve. The first was determining how to switch from a recovering peacetime economy to a wartime economy. The second was figuring out who would fill all the necessary jobs. Once America entered World War II, the government and private businesses coordinated to focus production on military equipment. Factories that had been making car engines for the consumer economy before the war began producing plane engines to support the war effort. Clothing manufacturers began producing uniforms for millions of new soldiers. But all of this production required factories to be working around the clock, which meant there were suddenly millions of jobs to fill. With many men volunteering for military service, this meant that the labor force got more diverse. Women began entering the workforce in large numbers. African Americans, long denied access to well-paying factory jobs, filled in employment gaps. By 1944, almost 18 million workers from diverse backgrounds had jobs in war production industries. This wartime economy brought America fully out of the Great Depression. But while World War II supercharged the American economy, it also created some issues. As the nation ramped up production of military goods, there was a shortage of consumer goods. For example, women's stockings became harder to find as nylon was used in parachutes, airplane cords, and ropes. Items like gasoline, meat, butter, and sugar were urgently needed to keep the fighting forces supplied. The government rationed goods to conserve them and make sure the military was equipped to fight. In this poster, you'll see how the government used media and advertising to encourage rationing. Rationing is controlling the amount of scarce goods that individuals can have at one time. During the war, ideas about conservation and sacrifice took on a patriotic meaning, even after the Great Depression. Okay, time for another check-in. How would you describe changes to the U.S. economy during World War II? But the war with Japan also brought out a dark side of America. Dating back to the 1800s, there had been a history of anti-Asian prejudice and hate, including strict restrictions on immigration from the region. After Pearl Harbor, some political and military leaders believed that Japanese Americans posed a risk to the security of the United States. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This gave the American military the authority to confiscate property of Japanese Americans living on the west coast of the U.S. and forcibly relocate them to internment camps. Of over 125,000 people relocated, 60% were Nisei, or native-born American citizens of Japanese ancestry. In the internment camps, multiple families were forced to live together in drafty camp barracks surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Despite these conditions, interned Japanese Americans were able to construct a semblance of normality in their surroundings. They set up camp newspapers, schools, and police and fire departments. Teens at a camp in Arkansas even held a senior prom. Many Japanese Americans volunteered for the United States military and served with distinction. Make sure to check out the PDF activity on the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. One last learning check for today. What were the impacts of World War II on Japanese Americans? Let's take a second to recap. In order to win the war in the Pacific, the Allies planned to neutralize Japan's naval advantage and use an island-hopping strategy that would bring their military resources closer to Japan. Economic necessity also led to changes in the workforce and the rationing of goods. Unfortunately, the internment of Japanese Americans, an unsettling similarity to the policies of an authoritarian regime, also revealed a darker side of history. Turning the tide of World War II in the Allies' favor showed their ability to work together to achieve a common goal. But it also revealed a darker side of human nature. And all of this together serves to remind us that history is everywhere.
Hey, hey.